let me introduce one of the most powerful strategies you can use that will allow you to bring a dynamic sense of light and shadow into your gesture drawings. Now, before we deal with shading something as complex as the human figure, let's first start with a more simple subject. I often tell students that drawing butternut squashes is a great way to prepare for figure drawing. This is because it shares many of the same shapes and characteristics as the human body, and it's the perfect subject to observe as we explore the shading process. The biggest mistake students make when shading is that they get caught up rendering small details and completely miss the big overall lighting scheme that defines the form. Gesture drawing is not about small details. It's about observing and constructing the figure as a dynamic whole. And this holds equally true as we apply light and shadow to our gesture drawings. So to start, we want to think about light and shadow in the most simple way we possibly can. We want to think about our subject as having a lit side and a shadow side. We want to be able to simplify and draw the moment when light ends and shadow begins. Now, of course, you can see a few small shadows that are on the lit side of the line of termination, but for the most part, this line does an excellent job simplifying the lighting scheme and dividing the subject into a lit side and a shadow side. It's only after you understand this basic division of light and shadow that you can shade with more detail. So now watch as I add complexity to this line of termination. When students start shading these kinds of details first, they tend to miss the overall lighting patterns. Don't make this mistake in your own drawings. You should always understand your shadows in terms of their most simple shapes first before adding complexity.
This lesson is from my new figure drawing bundle. In this collection of courses, you'll get dozens of lessons and demos that will ensure you can draw strong, dynamic figures.
The demonstration drawing you're about to see was done in under 10 minutes. You'll see me start with a primary action line. This is an attempt to simplify the pose into as few lines as possible. I started with the raised arm on our right and down the side of the torso on our right before flipping the line upward and to our left with the intention of really communicating how high that hip is raised and pushed out. From there, I'll take the line down the outside contour of the leg toward the foot. Next, I'll draw a secondary action line capturing the direction of the leg on our right, making sure that the foot on our right is lower than the foot on our left. This should all be done within the first minute of your gesture drawing. In fact, when I'm drawing, I try and get this done within the first 30 seconds. Hopefully you can see how well this simple collection of lines communicates the dynamic pose of the figure. Next, you'll see me draw the axis lines for the shoulders and pelvis. Now, everything at this point in the drawing is malleable, but the drawing becomes more solid as I add more information. Now I'll start to draw the two-chambered shape for the torso. This is the first closed shape of the drawing. With the torso in place, each new shape I draw needs to be drawn in relationship to it. Here you'll see me add the suprasternal notch and follow the sternocleidomastoid on our left up and around the shape of the head. With the suprasternal notch in place, I'll now draw other visible indications of the center line of the torso, for instance, the navel, as well as indications of the linea alba traveling out of the navel both above it and below it. Here, I'll indicate the direction of the arm on our left. Before adjusting the lines for the legs, I'm paying particular attention to the placement of the knees. Although you won't see much evidence of my measuring in this demonstration drawing, I'm always thinking in terms of measuring. I'm always making visual comparisons between the part of the body I'm drawing and the parts of the body that I've previously drawn. At this point, the figure is starting to solidify. This is roughly where you want your drawing to be within the first 3 minutes. Before I take the drawing any further or add any more detail, I want to make sure that the general shapes and proportions are working. I'm not seeing any major proportional errors, so I'll begin the process of building the rest of the figure on top of this simple gesture drawing. Now, there are some important differences between my drawing and the reference photo. My drawing is more exaggerated. I've made the pose more extreme. The upper torso that I've drawn is tilted more than the upper torso in the photograph. You can also see that I've pushed the hip out further to our left. This gives my drawing a greater sense of drama and dynamism. So you can see that I've drawn the breasts, and now I'll start to give shape to the legs. You'll notice that as my drawing takes shape, the lines I'm drawing with are getting darker and sharper, but I'm still saving the darkest lines for later on in the drawing. Before I refine the head, I'm going to use my pencil to take a proportional measurement from the reference photo. What I learned is that the distance from the indention on the left side of the torso to the suprasternal notch is about the same as the distance from the suprasternal notch to the top of the head. So as I refine the head, you'll notice that I initially drew it too big, and now I'm moving the top of it down. To make sure I remember which line is more accurate, you'll see that I'm drawing this new top of the head using a darker line. Again, these kinds of adjustments are common and normal, and you should expect that you'll make many of them while doing your gesture drawings. You'll see me make a similar adjustment to the arm on our left. I really like the way this drawing is turning out. So now I'll start to add some details to the contours, starting with the weight-bearing leg on our left. I'm using a strong, dark line to emphasize the curve that occurs when the muscles of the leg flex as they bear the weight of the figure. Next, you'll see me draw the curve of the tibia on our left before adding some detail in the foot. Generally speaking, this is where your drawing should be around the 5-minute mark. We have a dynamic statement of the entire pose. Although this doesn't always happen, within the first 5 minutes, I try and include enough information in the drawing that someone could get into the pose just by looking at the drawing itself without seeing the model. With the entirety of the pose addressed, now I can start to shift to smaller details. In addition to drawing smaller details, you'll see me making subtle refinements throughout the rest of the drawing. You'll notice that now I'm spending much more time crafting the contours of the figure, and I'm particularly interested in creating overlaps, where the contour for one part of the body comes in front of and overlaps the contour of another part of the body. Overlaps help give the gesture a sense of depth and volume because they tell us which parts of the body are in front and which are behind. A good example of this can be found where the right side of the torso overlaps the line representing the scapula. The further the drawing gets, the smaller the details get. I usually like to leave myself at least 3 minutes at the end of a gesture drawing for shading. Before I start the shading process, I'll ground the foot with an emphasis on the big toe, flesh out the raised arm, and emphasize the navel. Now I feel ready to begin the shading process. But before I do, I'd like to point out that not all of the drawing is equally finished. The leg on our right is left undone, as is the arm on our left. Remember, this is very normal and perfectly fine for a gesture drawing. One interesting thing I'd like you to note is that the parts of the drawing that are most finished are the parts of the body that are associated with the initial primary action line. You can still strongly detect the beautiful S-shaped curve that runs from the elbow of the raised arm and down the side of the torso on our right before moving over to the hip on our left and then down to the foot. I'll now begin the shading process by drawing a simplified line of termination, the line that will divide the lit side of the figure from the shadow side. In this first pass, you'll notice that I'm drawing the line of termination with a very light, soft line, and I'm only drawing the most prominent direction changes and curvatures of the line of termination. Here, you can see the shadow of the torso casting onto the leg on our right, before continuing down the right side of the leg. I'll end this initial pass of the line of termination with the ball-shaped joint of the knee. I'll now draw a second line of termination on the leg on our left. Remember, a complex form like the figure may have many different lines of termination on the different parts of the body. Sometimes they connect, and other times they do not. Here, you'll see me draw a simplified line of termination for the face. There's not a specific order that you should address these lines of termination, but generally speaking, you want to address the biggest forms of the body first and work your way down to the smaller forms. Remember, in drawing, simplicity should always come before complexity. So now that I've got a simplified line of termination for most of the parts of the body, I can make a second pass and start to record smaller details. On the second pass, you'll notice that the line I'm using is still soft, but darker than the first pass. There are 2 reasons for this. First, it lets the second pass at the line of termination stand out from the first. And second, this second more detailed pass at the line of termination represents the core shadow, the darker band of shadow that runs down the line of termination before the shadow side gets lighter due to reflected light. I'd like you to notice how well this second and more detailed pass at the line of termination is able to describe numerous anatomical details that were left out in the rest of the gesture process. For example, the line of termination now helps describe individual ribs. Now, using the side of my pencil, you'll see me lay a light wash of value on the shadow side of the line of termination. I'm moving my pencil back and forth using parallel strokes. By using the side of my pencil, I'm able to make thick, soft lines that appear to unify into a single value. Now that the largest and most prominent shadow shapes of this figure are drawn, I'll move around the drawing and refine the lines of termination, adding more and more detail and complexity to the drawing. The amazing thing about a well-crafted line of termination is that it has the power to describe all kinds of anatomical features on the surface of the body, even if you don't have a strong sense of the bones and muscles that are creating these shifts in light and shadow. As I mentioned before, this drawing was done from a 10-minute pose, and I'm quickly running out of time. So now I'm going to start thinking about what this drawing needs to have a sense of completion. This does not mean that all parts of the drawing need to be at an equal level of completion. Leaving parts of a gesture drawing unfinished can add a sense of drama and mystery to the drawing and invites the viewer to help complete the illusion that you've created on the page. When I'm finishing a drawing, the question I ask myself is, what do I want to stand out to the viewer? There are 3 primary ways you can emphasize parts of your drawing. One is to add darker and more refined contours, particularly contours that are drawn quickly and dynamically. You can find an example of this kind of line on the inside of the thigh of the leg on our right. Another way to add emphasis is to darken the values, particularly at the line of termination. And thirdly, by adding more detail. Detail draws people in and often distracts viewers from less finished parts of the drawing, leaving them with the impression that the drawing is more finished than it actually is. You can see all 3 of these emphasis strategies coming together at one of my favorite parts of the body to draw, the knees. Pay particular attention to the knee on our right. Another strategy that gives a sense of completion to a drawing is the grounding of the feet. Now, if I have drawn the head in a gesture drawing, and I don't always do, I think it's also important to block in the hair. Now, if you have time and you'd like to suggest some facial features, a detailed line of termination will often create a compelling illusion of the face. The trick here is not getting overly detailed. You'll notice that the facial features are implied using value, but they're not stated with any detail using contours. Remember, one of the goals of gesture drawing is to communicate as much information as you can using as few lines and strokes as possible. As with any other parts of the drawing process, this comes with practice. The pose time is nearly over, so I'd like to take just a moment to see if there are any final details I'd like to add. One of the most amazing things of the gesture drawing process is that any new thing you learn, whether it's anatomical or a technique, you can fold it into your gesture process. For the final touches, I'll draw the shadow that the head is casting over the neck, as well as flesh out the arm on our left just a little more. Time is up. This drawing took just under 10 minutes. It'll take a good amount of time and practice for you to be able to accomplish this much in a 10-minute pose. But hopefully, this demonstration has given you a sense of how the gesture drawing process works as a whole, as well as how much can be accomplished in a short amount of time by drawing efficiently and passionately. Again, it's not about drawing fast. It's more about simplifying the figure and focusing on what's essential to the pose instead of getting mired in small details. Gesture drawing is the first and most important step you can take toward learning how to do more complex figure drawings. But gesture drawings can also stand on their own as beautiful works of art.
You'll be amazed at what a good understanding of light and shadow can do to improve your figure drawing. But there's so much more to learn if you want to truly master drawing the human figure. In this collection of courses, you'll learn gesture drawing, the art of simplifying the figure into a dynamic pose that captures the action of the figure. You'll learn how to construct the figure from basic 3-dimensional forms before learning how to add anatomy and complexity. And finally, you'll learn how to shade the figure with dramatic and accurate light and shadow. You can learn all of this in the full course over at proko.com/Eviston.